mean I'll see it.
I never really talked about this with anyone outside of my family because, honestly, it makes me feel like I'm losing my mind just thinking back on it. You know how every kid has that one weird phase where they have an imaginary friend? My parents just thought I was creative. They thought I had a big imagination because we lived so far out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but thick, rotting woods and that heavy silence you only get when the nearest neighbor is miles away. They called him Leo. To me, Leo was as real as the dirt under my fingernails, but looking back now, I realize how much I ignored because I didn't know any better. I met him when I was about 6. We had this old, leaning equipment shed at the very edge of our property, right where the trees started to get really dense and the sunlight struggled to hit the ground. I remember wandering out there and seeing a boy. At least, I thought it was a boy. He was wearing this oversized, filthy yellow raincoat with the hood pulled way down, and he was sitting in the tall grass. He didn't move much. He just watched me. When I asked him who he was, he told me his name was Leo and that he lived back there. He pointed into the darkest part of the timber. We played every single day for 4 years. That's the part that sticks in my throat for years of my life. He never came into the house. He told me his parents were very strict and that they didn't like him being around other adults. He said if my mom or dad ever saw him, he'd have to go away forever and it would be my fault. When you're 7 or 8, that kind of logic works on you. You don't want to lose your only friend, so you keep the secret. We'd sit behind that shed and talk for hours. He asked me questions about what we ate for dinner, what time my dad went to sleep, and if the locks on the back door actually worked. He made it feel like a game, like we were spies checking the security of a fortress. Leo was always a bit off. He had this high, raspy voice that sounded like he was trying to whisper even when he was shouting. And he always smelled. It was this thick, cloying scent of old copper and wet earth, like something that had been sitting in a basement for too long. He never took off that raincoat, even in the middle of July when the humidity was so thick you could barely breathe. I remember once I tried to grab his hand to show him a toad I'd found, and his skin felt like cold, damp leather. It wasn't the skin of a child. It was hard and calloused, with these long, yellowed fingernails that looked like they'd been used to dig through the dirt. I just figured he didn't like baths. When I turned 10, things started to change. Leo got weirdly aggressive. He started telling me that he was going to have to move soon and that he wanted me to come with him. He said he had a special place deeper in the woods where we could play forever. I remember feeling this cold pit in my stomach for the first time. I told him no, and he got this look in his eyes. I can still see it. His eyes were these tiny, dark beads that didn't seem to have any white in them at all. He didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at me while he carved something out of a piece of gray wood with a rusted pocket knife. The next day, he was gone. He left a small, hand-carved wooden bird on the stump where we used to sit. It was crude, stained with something dark that looked like dried wine, and it had these jagged edges that cut my palm when I picked it up. I cried for weeks because I thought I'd lost my best friend. My parents just patted my head and told me I was outgrowing my imaginary phase. I eventually moved on, went to high school, and the memory of the boy in the yellow raincoat faded into that fuzzy part of your brain where you keep childhood dreams. Fast forward 15 years. I was back home helping my parents get the house ready to sell. They decided the old shed had to go because it was a huge eyesore and probably full of black mold. My dad and I went out there with crowbars and sledgehammers. The wood was so soft it practically disintegrated when we hit it. But when we got to the floorboards, we realized they weren't original. Someone had reinforced them from underneath with heavy plywood and rusted bolts. When my dad finally pried the first board up, the smell hit us like a physical blow. It wasn't just mold. It was the smell of Leo, that copper and rot, but concentrated, like it had been fermenting in the dark for over a decade. I actually had to step back and reach into the grass. My dad turned on his heavy-duty flashlight and shone it into the gap. He didn't say anything for a long minute. He just went pale, his face turning this sickly shade of gray. We ended up tearing the whole floor up. Underneath, there was a literal nest. It's the only way I can describe it. There was a filthy, stained sleeping bag that had been patched together with duct tape and scraps of my own old clothes, stuff I thought I'd lost as a kid. There were hundreds of empty cans of cat food and beans, all opened with the same jagged, rough edges. But it was the walls of the crawl space that made my blood turn to ice. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, of Polaroids pinned to the support beams. Most of them were of me. There were shots of me playing in the yard, shots of me through my bedroom window while I was sleeping, and shots of my parents through the kitchen glass. Some of them were so close up you could see the texture of my skin. They were dated on the back in a messy, cramped handwriting. He hadn't lived back there in the woods. He had been living under my feet. He'd been listening to our footsteps, our conversations, and our breathing for 4 years. And then I found the trophies. In the corner of that hall, there was a pile of small bones. Dozens of them. Birds, squirrels, even a neighbor's cat that had gone missing when I was 7. They weren't just dead, they had been meticulously disassembled. Some of them were tied together with my old shoelaces to make these horrific little sculptures. But the worst part, the part that I can't stop thinking about, was the wooden bird he gave me. My dad found a small, hidden compartment under the nest where Leo had kept his tools. Inside a rusted tin box, there was a lock of my hair, a couple of my baby teeth that the tooth fairy had supposedly taken, and another carving. It was a larger version of the bird he gave me, but this one was hollow. My dad cracked it open with his pliers, thinking there might be a note inside. Inside the hollow wood were 3 human fingernails. They were small, like a child's. And they weren't old. They were clean, white, and looked like they had been torn out recently. My heart stopped when I realized that the dates on some of the more recent photos under the shed weren't from 15 years ago. Some of the Polaroids showed the house with the new siding my dad put on just 2 years ago. He never left. He just stopped talking to me. He stayed in the dark, watching me grow up, watching my parents get old, waiting for the moment the game would start again. The police came and took everything, but they never found him. They found tracks leading deeper into the woods, into a section of the marsh where the ground is too soft to follow. Sometimes, when I'm staying in my old room, I hear a faint, rhythmic scratching coming from somewhere deep inside the walls. It isn't a mouse. It's too slow, too deliberate. It sounds like someone with very long, very hard nails, slowly carving something out of wood, just waiting for me to come back out to the shed and play. I don't think he was ever a kid. I think he was just a man who knew exactly how to make a lonely child keep a secret. And now, I'm the only one left who knows what his voice sounds like when he whispers in the dark. I'm moving out tomorrow. I'm not even packing everything. I just need to get away from the trees. If you ever feel like someone is watching you from the edge of the woods, don't look for a friend. Just run.
Next story.
You know Ethan, right? We've been inseparable since the 2nd grade. We were those kids who had everything in common, from our obsession with vintage horror movies to the way we both hated the crust on sandwiches. But the core of our friendship, the thing that anchored us for over a decade, was the handshake. We called it the iron lock. It was this overly complicated 30-second routine of fist bumps, finger snaps, and a specific rhythmic clap at the end. We did it every single time we saw each other. It was our ritual. It was how I knew he was my brother. Then came that summer. Ethan's parents sent him to this leadership camp up in the northern woods, Crestwood Peak. It was one of those no cell phones, back to nature deals. He was gone for 8 weeks. When he finally got back, I was waiting on his porch, vibrating with excitement to tell him about everything he'd missed. The front door opened and Ethan stepped out. At first glance, it was him. The same messy dark hair, the same crooked nose from when he fell off his bike in middle school, the same faded band t-shirt I'd seen him wear 100 times. But the way he moved, it was stiff. He walked like someone who was still learning how to balance on two legs. I jumped up and stuck my hand out, starting the first motion of the iron lock. I did the double tap to the chest and the low 5. Ethan just stood there. He looked down at my hand like I was holding a dead animal. There was this blank, hollow stare in his eyes that made the hair on my neck stand up. He didn't move for what felt like a full minute. Then he let out this short, barking laugh that didn't sound anything like his usual wheezing chuckle. He told me he was just exhausted from the trip and that his brain was fried from the hiking. He said he'd just forgotten the moves. He laughed it off, but his eyes stayed flat. They were like two pieces of polished black glass, reflecting me back at myself but showing nothing of what was behind them. Over the next few weeks, the glitch didn't go away. It got worse. Ethan used to be obsessed with drawing. His room was always cluttered with sketchbooks full of these intricate, gory monsters. When I went over to hang out, the sketchbooks were gone. He told me he decided to focus on practicalities now. He started eating things he used to hate. I watched him eat a sandwich with the crusts on, chewing slowly, staring at the wall with this intense, terrifying focus. I asked him if he remembered the treehouse we built behind his garage, the one where he nearly broke his arm. He just nodded and said, yes, the wooden structure. It was very high. He didn't mention the No Girls Allowed sign we painted in neon orange or the time we hid a box of stolen cigars under the floorboards. He was reciting a fact, not sharing a memory. The breaking point for me was his dog, Buster. Buster was a golden retriever who usually tackled Ethan the second he walked through the door. But after Ethan came back from Crestwood, Buster wouldn't go near him. The poor dog would crouch in the corner of the kitchen, growling deep in his throat, his tail tucked so tight it was pressed against his stomach. One afternoon, I was over there and I heard Buster let out this horrific, high-pitched yelp from the backyard. I ran to the window and saw Ethan standing over him. Ethan wasn't doing anything, he was just standing perfectly still, looking down at the dog. Buster was shivering so hard he could barely stand. When Ethan turned to look at me through the glass, his face was a mask of total indifference. There was no anger, no confusion, just a void. Everything came crashing down last night. I got a call from Ethan's mom at 3 a.m. She was hysterical. I could barely understand her through the sobbing, but she kept saying, "It's not him, it's not my boy." I drove over there like a maniac. When I arrived, the front door was wide open. I found her in Ethan's room, sitting on the floor, surrounded by piles of paper. Ethan was gone. His car was still in the driveway, but he had vanished into the woods behind the house. She handed me a leather-bound journal she'd found hidden under his mattress. It wasn't one of his old sketchbooks. I opened it, and my stomach flipped. The handwriting was tiny, cramped, and surgically precise, not Ethan's messy scrawl. The entire book was a manual. It was a collection of observations regarding Ethan's life. The first page was just a list of names. My name was at the top, circled in red. Underneath it were notes. Target, best friend. Interaction, complex manual greeting. Rhythm, 1-2 clap pause fist. Note, must practice tactile pressure. There were sketches of our handshake, broken down into diagrams like a physics textbook. There were notes on how Ethan took his coffee, the specific way he tilted his head when he was lying, and the exact pitch of his voice when he was angry. But it got visceral on the later pages. There were Polaroid photos taped into the margins. Some were of Ethan sleeping at camp, taken from a distance. But then there were photos of anatomy. There were close-up shots of Ethan's teeth, his fingernails, and a particular mole on his shoulder. Next to a photo of Ethan's ear, the writer had noted replication of cartilage structure successful. Sensation of hearing is acute but discordant. I felt the bile rising in my throat as I flipped to the end. The last entry was dated 3 days ago. It read, "The mother is becoming suspicious. Biological scent markers are failing to trigger her maternal recognition. The dog has already identified the deviation. Elimination of the canine was necessary to maintain the integrity of the role. The original subject's remains in the Crestwood Ravine are likely compromised by local fauna. Must transition to the next phase. The friend is the final tether. Once the friend is convinced, the integration is complete." I looked at Ethan's mom, and then I looked at the floor. In the corner of the room, tucked behind the radiator, I saw a small plastic bag. I picked it up. Inside were several jagged pieces of what looked like yellowed ivory and a clump of dark, matted hair. I realized with a jolt of pure horror that they were teeth. Ethan's teeth. The thing in the house had been keeping them, maybe as a reference, or maybe as a trophy. Then I heard it. The sound of the back door creaking open. I froze. Ethan's mom didn't even look up. She just kept rocking back and forth, whispering her son's name. I walked out into the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. The house was silent, except for the heavy, wet thud of footsteps coming up the stairs. "Hey," a voice called out. It was Ethan's voice. It was perfect. The same rasp, the same casual tone. "You're over late, man. Want to do the lock?" He appeared at the top of the stairs. He was drenched in sweat, and his clothes were torn. There was something dark and wet smeared across his forehead. It looked like old blood and dirt. He was smiling, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. His mouth opened a little too wide, showing rows of teeth that looked just a little too white, a little too straight. I didn't say a word. I just backed away toward the window. He took a step toward me, extending his hand. He began the first motion of our handshake, the double tap to the chest. But he did it too hard. I could hear the dull thud of his hand hitting his sternum. And for a split second, the skin on his cheek seemed to sag, like it wasn't properly attached to the bone underneath. I bolted. I jumped out the first floor window, hit the bushes, and ran for my car. I didn't look back until I was miles away. I'm at a motel now, 3 towns over. I've called the police, but what am I supposed to tell them? That my friend isn't my friend because he forgot a handshake? They went to the house, but they said Ethan and his mom were both there. They said she seemed distressed but stable and that Ethan was taking care of her. They told me to get some sleep. But here's the thing. About 20 minutes ago, I got a text. It was from Ethan's number. No words, just a video file. I opened it, and it was a recording of me right now through the motel window. I'm watching myself type this on my phone. And in the reflection of the glass in the video, I can see him standing right behind the bush near my car. He's not moving. He's just standing there, holding his hand out in the first position of the iron lock. He's waiting for me to finish the ritual. And I think he's tired of practicing.
Next story.
Everyone has that one friend they've known so long they basically feel like a limb. For me, that was Elias. We grew up in this sleepy, gray town where the only thing to do was rot or get out, and we chose to rot together. Elias lived in this massive, sprawling Victorian house on the edge of the woods, the kind of place with wraparound porches and those high, narrow windows that look like squinting eyes. His dad was some kind of high-level industrial consultant who was never home, so the place was ours. We spent a decade in that house, playing video games in the attic and drinking stolen beers on the roof. But there was always one rule. One hard, immovable boundary. We never, under any circumstances, went into the basement. Elias was casual about it. He told me when we were 10 that his dad kept dangerous chemicals down there for his work, industrial solvents and volatile compounds that could kill you if you breathed them in. It made sense at the time. The door was heavy oak, reinforced with a deadbolt that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. Sometimes, when I'd stay over, I'd hear a faint, rhythmic humming coming from beneath the floorboards, like a heavy refrigeration unit running constantly. I just figured it was part of the lab. You don't question the rules of a house that feels like a second home. Everything changed during our senior year. Elias's grandmother passed away 3 states over, and his parents dragged him along for the funeral and the estate cleaning. I was tasked with staying at the house to look after their dog, a mangy, nervous golden retriever named Cooper. I liked the house when it was full of noise and people, but alone? It felt different. The air was heavy, and the silence seemed to press against my eardrums. On the 3rd night, Cooper started acting up. He wouldn't eat, and he kept standing at the top of the basement stairs, whining this low, guttural sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. He'd scratch at the oak door until his paws bled, leaving these wet, red smears on the wood. I tried to pull him away, but he was a dead weight, his eyes fixed on the gap beneath the door. I told myself I was just looking for a way to calm the dog down. I told myself that maybe a pipe had burst or something was leaking. I went to the kitchen and started rooting through the junk drawer, looking for a flashlight. That's when I saw it. Tucked inside an old, rusted tin of Altoids, hidden beneath a pile of rubber bands and expired coupons, was a heavy brass key. It didn't look like a normal house key. It looked old. It looked important. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, just staring at that key. The humming from the basement felt louder than a deep, vibrating thrum that I could feel in the soles of my feet. I walked to the basement door. My heart was slamming against my ribs so hard it hurt. I slid the key into the deadbolt. It turned with a sickeningly smooth click. No rust. No resistance. It had been used recently. Often. When I pushed the door open, I expected the sharp, stinging scent of bleach or ammonia. I expected a lab. Instead, a wave of cold, stagnant air hit me. It smelled like copper and something sickly sweet, like rotting peaches covered in vinegar. I flicked the light switch. The stairs were steep and narrow, leading down into a darkness that the dim yellow bulb at the top couldn't touch. I descended slowly, my hand gripping the rail so hard my knuckles turned white. When I reached the bottom and found the second light pole, the basement flickered into view. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. It didn't look like a basement. It looked like a museum. Or a tomb. The room was clinical. White tile had been laid over the original stone floor, and the walls were lined with industrial-grade steel shelving. But it wasn't chemicals on those shelves. It was jars. Hundreds of them. I walked to the nearest shelf, my breath hitching in my throat. Each jar was meticulously labeled with a date and a description in Elias's neat, cramped handwriting. I leaned in, my face inches from the glass. Inside the first jar, floating in a clear, viscous liquid, was a clump of hair. Dark brown. My hair. The label read, August 14th, first haircut. Barber shop floor. I felt a surge of cold nausea. I moved to the next jar. October 22nd, scab from playground fall. Right knee. Inside was a dried, brownish red flake of skin. I kept moving, my legs feeling like lead. There were jars of fingernail clippings. Jars containing used band-aids, still crusted with my old blood. There was even a jar holding a collection of my baby teeth that my mom had told me she lost years ago. The dangerous chemicals his dad supposedly kept. It was gallons of formaldehyde and medical-grade preservatives. Then I turned toward the far wall. It was covered from floor to ceiling in a massive corkboard. I felt the air leave my lungs. There were thousands of photos. Not the kind of photos friends take of each other. These were different. Most were grainy, taken from a distance through a long lens. There were shots of me sleeping through my bedroom window, hundreds of them, spanning years. Shots of me eating breakfast. Shots of me crying at my grandfather's funeral. But the worst part, the part that still makes me want to scream, was the specimen section. Elias had taped things to the wall next to the photos. Used tissues I'd thrown in the trash, carefully flattened out to show the mucus and blood. A half-eaten apple I'd tossed into a bin behind the gym in 10th grade, now shriveled and black, preserved in a vacuum-sealed bag. And then I saw the toothbrushes. My toothbrushes. Every single one I had lost or replaced over the last decade was there, lined up in chronological order. The bristles were still stained with the faint, dried remnants of my saliva and toothpaste. He hadn't just been watching me. He had been harvesting me. He had been collecting the discarded pieces of my life, the bits of DNA I left behind, and cataloging them like a goddamn science project. In the center of the room, there was a large, heavy object covered in a white sheet. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grab the edge of the fabric. I yanked it away. Underneath was a life-sized mannequin, but it wasn't made of plastic or wood. Elias had constructed a frame out of wire and wax, and then he had applied things to it. He had taken the hair he'd collected and woven it into the scalp. He had used the old clothes I thought I'd lost to dress it. But the face, he had sculpted a face out of some kind of pale, translucent silicone, and he had embedded my actual biological matter into it. My old skin flakes, my dried blood, it was all pressed into the wax, creating a mottled, horrific patchwork that vaguely resembled me. It was a vessel. He wasn't just obsessed. He was trying to rebuild me. I heard a sound from upstairs. The front door opening. The heavy, familiar thud of Elias's boots on the floorboards. "Hey, you in here?" His voice called out, bright, cheerful, completely normal. I didn't think. I couldn't. I sprinted toward the back of the basement, where a small, rusted coal chute led out to the backyard. I squeezed through the narrow opening, the jagged metal tearing into my shoulders and chest, but I didn't feel the pain. I fell into the wet grass outside and just ran. I didn't go back to my house. I didn't call my parents. I ran until I hit the main road, flagged down a passing trucker, and begged him to take me to the next city. I moved out of the state the very next day. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't say goodbye. I changed my name, deleted every social media account, and cut ties with everyone I knew back home. Sometimes I'll be sitting in a coffee shop or walking through a crowded mall, and I'll feel that familiar prickle on the back of my neck. I'll turn around, expecting to see a camera lens poking out from behind a corner. I wonder how many specimens he has now. I wonder if he ever finished that thing in the basement. But what keeps me awake at night, what really makes my blood run cold, is remembering the very last jar I saw on the shelf before I ran. It was the only one that was empty. It was the largest jar in the room, big enough to fit a person. The label was dated for the day I was supposed to finish house sitting, and it only had one word written on it in that neat, cramped handwriting: completion. I still don't use a toothbrush more than once. I burn them in the sink now. I don't leave anything behind. Because I know he's still out there, and I know he hates it when his collection has a missing piece.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.